The Galactic Council Chamber was the largest room ever built by any known species. It sat at the heart of Station Orivas, a ring-shaped station that floated in orbit around a quiet, neutral star, far from any empire's border. The chamber could hold over 1,000 delegates from hundreds of different species. And today, for the 40th Galactic Harmony Summit, almost every seat was filled. Kang Do-hyun sat in the human delegation section, which was small and tucked near the back. He was a man in his mid-40s, with a calm face and dark eyes that always seemed to be listening, even when no one was speaking. He wore a simple dark suit, no medals, no decorations. His hands rested on the table in front of him, still and relaxed. If someone looked at him and tried to guess what he was, they would probably say teacher, or maybe a librarian. They would never guess soldier. That was 12 years ago. Do-hyun had left the military a long time back. He had chosen diplomacy because he believed in talking before fighting. He believed in patience. And so he sat quietly while the council discussed trade routes and border agreements, and he waited for his turn to speak. Around him, the chamber buzzed with alien voices. The Marathi delegates sat tall in their seats, their long silver bodies straight and proud. The Pelkine representatives took up twice the space of anyone else, their thick armored plates clicking when they shifted. Dozens of other species filled the rows, some with wings, some with too many eyes, some that floated instead of walked. All of them had been part of the galactic community for centuries. Humanity had been here for only 12 years. 12 years was nothing, a blink. Most species still thought of humans the way a person might think of a new neighbor's child. Small, harmless, maybe a little noisy, but not worth worrying about. The official galactic classification for humans was Category 6, Endurance Persistence Predator, which sounded impressive until you learned that almost nobody paid attention to those old biological files. What the galaxy actually saw when they looked at humans was a species that smiled too much, laughed too loud, got emotional over small things, and seemed more interested in making friends than making war. Counselor Thevan, the senior Marathi diplomat, watched Do-hyun from across the chamber with mild curiosity. Thevan had served on the council for over 90 years. He had seen species rise and fall. He had negotiated with warlords and tyrants. And in all that time, he had never once felt threatened by a human. They were pleasant enough, he thought, cooperative, eager to help. But there was nothing behind the smile that concerned him. During a recess, Thevan stood in the corridor with a group of senior delegates and shared this opinion openly. The humans are fine, he said, his long fingers making a dismissive wave. They are polite. They follow the rules. But they are not a species of consequence. They smile too much to be dangerous. Ambassador Galuri, the Pelkine representative, agreed with a low grunt. Galuri was large even for a Pelkine, nearly 3 meters tall, with thick bone plates covering his shoulders and chest. His species had evolved as apex predators on a heavy gravity world, and they carried themselves with the confidence of creatures who had never been hunted. Galuri had a particular disdain for humans. Just that morning, he had watched a young human cultural exchange officer flinch at the sound of a door slamming, and he had laughed about it with his aides for an hour. Prey species, Galuri said, shaking his massive head. They jump at shadows. They make art about their feelings. They are the galaxy's pet herbivores. Several delegates around him laughed. One or two glanced toward the human section with something close to pity. None of them noticed that Kang Do-hyun, walking past in the corridor, had heard every word. His expression did not change. He did not slow down. He simply kept walking, his hands in his pockets, his face as calm and unreadable as still water. When the session resumed, Do-hyun presented his proposal. He spoke clearly and simply about a joint humanitarian corridor in a contested sector, a safe passage for medical ships and refugee transports. His voice was steady, His words were reasonable. He asked for nothing except cooperation. A few delegates nodded politely. Most barely listened. When he finished, the council moved on to the next item without discussion. Do-hyun returned to his seat and folded his hands again. If he was disappointed, no one could tell. Far above the council chamber, docked at one of the station's outer ports, sat the HSS Beko. It was a human escort frigate, mid-sized, painted in dark gray with a white tiger emblem on its hull. It was the only human warship at the station, assigned as a simple escort for the diplomatic team. Nobody paid it much attention. It was small compared to the Pelkine battle cruisers and the Marathi patrol ships that drifted nearby. Just another forgettable human vessel. On the bridge of the Beko, Captain Yoon Nari sat in her command chair, reading a report on her tablet. She was a woman of about 40, lean and sharp-featured, with short black hair and eyes that missed nothing. She ran her ship quietly and efficiently. Her crew respected her, not because she shouted or demanded, but because she never asked them to do anything she would not do herself. The bridge was calm. Crew members worked at their stations, talking softly, running routine checks. Lieutenant Park Jinu, the ship's young tactical officer, was at his console, reviewing star charts. He was 26 years old, bright and eager, with a habit of keeping a personal journal where he sketched and wrote notes about every alien species he encountered. He was, by any measure, a gentle person. At exactly 1400 hours station time, Nari's personal communicator chimed with an encrypted transmission. She picked it up, read the message, and her face did not change at all. Not a muscle moved. She set the communicator down and looked at Jinu. "Lieutenant," she said, her voice perfectly even, "run a deep-range scan of the outer sectors, full spectrum, quiet mode." Jinu looked up. He knew that tone. He had only heard it once before, during a training exercise that simulated the worst possible scenario. He did not ask questions. He turned to his console and began the scan. The results came back in 4 minutes. Jinu stared at his screen for a long time. Then he turned to Nari and said, very quietly, "There is an unregistered fleet holding position just outside standard sensor range. At least 40 ships. They are running silent." Nari looked at the data. She looked at it for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said one word. "Understood." She stood up from her chair. She did not raise her voice. She did not hit an alarm. She simply looked at each member of her bridge crew, one by one, and they looked back at her, and something passed between them that no alien species would have been able to name. Within 60 seconds, every human on the Beko moved to battle stations. No alarm sounded. No announcement was made. They simply stopped what they were doing, put down their coffee cups and their books and their letters from home, and went to where they needed to be. The alien liaison officers on board watched this happen with a growing sense of unease. They could not explain what had changed. The air felt the same. The lights had not shifted. No one had shouted or given any visible signal. But something was different now. Something behind the eyes of every human on the ship had quietly woken up. Down in the council chamber, Kang Do-hyun was still sitting in his seat, still smiling, still looking like the most harmless man in the room. Nobody noticed that his hands were no longer relaxed. The first explosion hit Station Orivas at 1432. It came without warning, a massive shockwave that rolled through the entire structure and threw delegates out of their seats. The lights in the council chamber flickered. The floor shook. Somewhere deep in the station, metal screamed as a section of hull twisted inward. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Then every alarm on the station went off at once. The external display screens in the chamber lit up automatically, showing the space outside. What they showed made the entire room go silent. Dozens of warships had appeared out of nothing, decloaking in a wide formation around the station. They were dark ships, angular and ugly, covered in sharp ridges like the shells of insects. Their hulls pulsed with a sick, greenish light. The Vreth Dominion. Every delegate in the chamber knew that name. The Vreth were an insectoid empire that had waged war across 3 sectors nearly 60 years ago. They had been defeated by a coalition of species and supposedly pacified, forced into a treaty that stripped their fleet and confined them to their home systems. But the ships outside the station were not old relics. They were new. They were armed, and there were at least 40 of them. The second barrage hit, and this time the station groaned like a living thing in pain. Emergency bulkheads began dropping across corridors. The chamber erupted into chaos. Barathi delegates shouted commands in their own language. A group of small, bird-like Tasani diplomats screamed and tried to fly toward the exits. The Pelkine representatives stood frozen, their armor plates locked tight in a defensive reflex. Counselor Thevin rose from his seat, his tall silver body trembling. He raised his hands and called out in a voice that cracked with fear, "We must signal surrender immediately. If we submit, they may spare the station. We cannot fight this." Ambassador Goluri, the massive Pelkine who had laughed at humans that very morning, said nothing. He had moved away from the windows and was crouching behind a heavy console, his great armored body pressed low to the ground. His eyes were wide. For all his size and his bone plates and his predator heritage, he was hiding. In the middle of all this noise and panic, Kang Da-hyun sat very still. The delegates nearest to him would later say that what they saw in that moment was the most unsettling thing they had ever witnessed. More unsettling than the Vreth fleet, more unsettling than the explosions, because what happened to Da-hyun was not dramatic. There was no shout, no transformation, no display of rage. His smile simply disappeared, slowly, like a candle going out. And what was left behind was something none of them had ever seen on a human face before. His eyes changed, not the color, not the shape. Something behind them shifted. It was as if a door had opened in the back of his mind, and something very old and very patient had stepped through it. He was not angry. He was not scared. He was focused, in a way that went beyond what most species understood focus to mean. It was the look of a creature that had suddenly identified a threat to its pack, and was now calculating, with perfect calm, exactly how to end it. A Marathi aide standing nearby felt a chill run through his body. He could not explain it. The human had not moved, had not made a sound. But every instinct the aide had, instincts buried deep in millions of years of evolution, told him to step back, to not be in this creature's way. Do-hyun reached into his jacket and pulled out a communicator. He pressed a single button and spoke 6 words, his voice flat and steady. Condition black. Protect the station. Now. On the bridge of the Baekho, Captain Yoon Nari heard those words through her earpiece. She closed her eyes for 1 second. When she opened them, every trace of warmth was gone from her face. She looked at her bridge crew and said, "You heard him." What happened next was something the alien liaison officers aboard the Baekho would talk about for the rest of their lives. Every human on the ship changed. It was not sudden like flipping a switch. It was more like watching water freeze. One moment, they were people, laughing, talking, human. The next moment, they were something else. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Smiles disappeared. Shoulders squared. Eyes sharpened. The entire atmosphere of the ship shifted, as if the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in an instant. Han Sumi, the ship's chief medical officer, had been in the mess hall 3 minutes ago, offering homemade cookies to a Marathi liaison officer and telling him about her grandmother's recipe. Now she was in the medical bay, moving with mechanical precision, laying out surgical tools, preparing blood supplies, calculating triage protocols. Her hands, which had been soft and gentle when she offered the cookies, were now steady as stone. Her eyes were cold and clear. When a young alien medic asked her what was happening, She did not look up. She simply said, "Prepare for incoming wounded, not ours." In the Marine quarters, Sergeant Bei Tae-sung was already in his armor. 5 minutes ago, he had been lying in his bunk, reading a book of old poems, his favorite one about the moon over a quiet river. Now the book was closed, tucked neatly under his pillow, and he was checking his rifle with hands that knew every piece of that weapon, the way a musician knows an instrument. His face was perfectly calm. His breathing was slow and even. When his fire team assembled in the corridor, none of them spoke. They moved together in silence, each one knowing exactly where to go and what to do, like wolves forming a hunting line. The Taesani liaison officer on Deck 4 pressed himself against the wall as Taesung's team moved past. He had served on joint operations with many species. He had seen Pelkine warriors charge into battle with roaring war cries. He had seen Marathi soldiers march in elegant formations. But he had never seen anything like this. The humans made no sound, no war cries, no chanting, no beating of chests. They moved in complete silence, their boots barely making noise on the metal floor, their eyes scanning every shadow and corner. It was not the silence of discipline. It was the silence of predators who did not want their prey to hear them coming. On the bridge, Lieutenant Park Jin-woo was running calculations faster than anyone had ever seen him work. His fingers flew across his console, pulling up fleet formations, weapon ranges, shield frequencies. The ship's tactical AI offered a recommended course of action, a defensive retreat pattern, pulling back to create distance from the Vreth fleet. Jin-woo read the recommendation, deleted it, and plotted an attack vector straight into the center of the Vreth formation. Nari looked at the course he had plotted, a direct charge into 40 warships with a single frigate. She studied it for 2 seconds, then nodded once. Execute. The Baiko's engines roared to life, and the small gray frigate surged forward, accelerating toward the Vreth fleet at full combat speed. In the council chamber, the external displays showed the Baiko moving. Every delegate in the room watched. They saw this tiny ship, this insignificant escort vessel, turn toward 40 enemy warships and fly directly at them. No hesitation, no attempt to retreat or hide or wait for help. Counselor Thevan stared at the screen, his silver hands gripping the edge of his console. His mouth opened slightly. He whispered, "What are they doing? That is a single ship. That is suicide." Kang Do-hun was standing now. He stood straight and still, his eyes on the screen, watching the Baiko fly toward the enemy. He heard Thevan's words, and he turned his head slowly to look at the tall Marathi diplomat. The look in Do-hun's eyes made Thevan take a step back. It was not hostility. It was not madness. It was something far worse. It was certainty. The absolute, unshakable certainty of a creature that had made its decision and would not be moved from it, not by fear, not by logic, not by death itself. Do-hun spoke, and his voice was quiet and steady, and carried through the silent chamber like a blade. What we were built to do. Nobody asked him what he meant. Deep down in the oldest parts of their brains, the parts that remembered what it was like to be hunted in the dark, every single alien in that room already knew. The Baiko hit the Vreth formation like a knife thrown into a swarm. Captain Nari did not fight the way the Vreth expected. She did not fight the way any species in the galaxy expected. Most warships engaged at range, trading fire in organized lines, following patterns that had been established over centuries of galactic warfare. The Vreth in particular relied on numbers. Their doctrine was simple and ancient. Surround, overwhelm, consume. It had worked against dozens of species across 3 sectors. It was efficient and brutal. Nari ignored all of it. She drove the Baiko straight through the gap between 2 Vreth cruisers, so close that the frigate's shields scraped against theirs in a shower of blue sparks. The Vreth ships tried to turn and fire, but they were too close together. Their own shots hit each other. In the confusion, Genu fired a full spread of torpedoes into the belly of the nearest cruiser. The explosions tore open its lower hull, and the ship listed sideways, crashing into its neighbor. Nari did not slow down. She swung the Baiko around the curve of Station Orivas itself, using the station's massive structure as a shield. The Vreth fleet could not fire at her without hitting the station, and for 2 precious minutes, that hesitation gave her room to breathe. She used those 2 minutes to kill 3 more ships. The Baiko was not a powerful ship. It was a frigate, built for escort duty, not for taking on a fleet. But Nari flew it as if the ship was part of her own body. She used the station's debris field as cover, ducking behind wrecked hull plates and destroyed communication arrays. She used the station's gravity to slingshot around corners, appearing behind Vreth's ships that thought she was in front of them. Every move was precise, unexpected, and vicious. On the bridge, Genu worked in a kind of trance. His hands never stopped moving. He tracked every enemy ship, calculated every firing angle, predicted every movement. When the tactical AI suggested a conservative repositioning, he dismissed it without a word. When it suggested retreating to a safe distance, he turned the AI's recommendation screen off entirely. He did not need a machine to tell him what to do. Something older and deeper was driving him now. An instinct that could read the flow of battle, the way his ancestors had read the movements of animals on the plains. The Vreth commanders were confused. Their tactical doctrine had no answer for this. No species charged toward danger. No species attacked a superior force head-on with a smaller ship, and then refused to die. Their hive-mind coordination, which usually made them unstoppable, was struggling to adapt. Every time they adjusted to the Baiko's position, the ship was somewhere else. Every time they formed a firing line, the frigate slipped through a gap they did not know existed. But the Baiko was still one ship against many, and it began to take damage. A Vreth destroyer caught it with a direct hit to the port side, and the entire port weapons array went dark. Half the guns on the left side of the ship were gone. Nari's response was immediate. Rotate the ship. Present starboard to the enemy. Use the dead side as armor. The helmsman executed the order without hesitation. The Baiko spun on its axis, putting its damaged, weaponless port side toward the Vreth, and fired every starboard weapon it had into the nearest enemy ship. It was like a wounded animal turning its scarred side to the wolves and biting with the other. On Deck 7, the shields failed completely. A Vreth energy blast punched through the hull, and the deck began to decompress. Air rushed toward the breach like a river toward a hole. Sergeant Bei Taesung was there in 90 seconds. He and his Marines ran toward the breach, not away from it. They carried emergency hull plates, heavy sheets of reinforced metal that were meant to be installed by repair drones in a calm dock. Taesung and his team carried them by hand, fighting against the pull of the vacuum, their boots locked to the deck with magnetic grips. The ship was maneuvering at full combat speed, turning and rolling as Nari fought. The Marines were thrown against walls, slammed to the floor, and pulled toward the screaming hole in the hull. They sealed the breach in 4 minutes. Taesung's hands were bleeding inside his gloves. He did not notice. When it was done, he simply said, "Deck 7 secure," into his communicator, and moved on to the next problem. In the council chamber, the delegates watched all of this on the external and internal feeds. They saw the Baiko twist and fight and refuse to die. They saw humans thrown across rooms by explosions, get up and keep working. They saw Nari's face on the bridge camera, utterly calm, giving orders in a steady voice while her ship burned around her. But the battle was not only in space. At 1451, the Vreth launched boarding parties. Armored drop pods punched through the station's docking ports and outer hull, and Vreth warriors poured into the corridors of Station Orivas. They were terrifying creatures, each one nearly 2.5 meters tall, covered in dark chitinous armor, with 4 arms ending in bladed claws. They moved with the coordination of a single mind, because they were. The Vreth shared a limited hive consciousness that let them fight as one organism. The alien security forces on the station broke almost immediately. A Marathi security team fired a volley, saw that it barely scratched the Vreth armor. A Pelkine guard squad, despite their size, fell apart when the Vreth flanked them from 2 corridors at once. The station's defenses were not built for this kind of assault. Kang Do-hyun took over. He did not ask permission. He did not wait for authorization. He simply began giving orders, and something in his voice made people listen. Not just humans, everyone. He directed the Marathi security teams to fall back to choke points where the corridors narrowed. He told the Pelkine guards to use their bulk to block doorways. He coordinated barricade positions using the station's internal map, turning every intersection into a trap. And he sent the human security personnel forward. There were only 19 humans on the station outside of the Baekho's crew. 19 against hundreds of Vreth warriors. The alien delegates watched them go, with something between pity and confusion. 19 soft, squishy, unarmored mammals walking toward monsters. What they saw on the corridor cameras changed everything. The humans did not fight like any species the Council had ever seen. They did not charge. They did not roar. They did not stand in lines and trade fire. They moved in small teams, flowing through the corridors like water, covering each other, communicating in hand signals and quiet whispers. They set ambushes, hit hard, and disappeared before the Vreth could respond. When one path was blocked, they found another. When a weapon stopped working, they picked up something else. They adapted in seconds, changing their tactics between one heartbeat and the next. And they did not stop. A human security officer took a claw strike across the chest that opened his suit and drew blood. He stumbled, gritted his teeth, and kept firing. A woman with a broken arm used her good hand to drag a wounded Marathi guard behind cover, then picked up the guard's weapon and returned fire. They fought with a relentless, silent intensity that was more frightening than any war cry. Near the council chamber, a Vreth warrior broke through the barricade and cornered a group of Tisani delegates, small and fragile and unable to fight. The Vreth raised its bladed arms. Han Sumi stepped between them. She had no weapon. She had a medical laser cutter, a tool meant for surgery, barely strong enough to cut through skin. She was half the size of the Vreth warrior. She stood in the corridor in her medical uniform, blood on her sleeves from treating wounded, and she looked up at the insectoid monster and did not move. The Vreth hesitated. It was only a second, but in that second, Bae Taesung's fire team came around the corner and put the creature down with precise, controlled fire. Sumi looked at Taesung. Taesung looked at Sumi. Neither of them said a word. Sumi turned back to the wounded. Taesung moved on. Counselor Thevin watched this on the chamber's screens. He saw a human Marine take a wound that would have put any Marathi on the ground, and the Marine did not even slow down. He saw the medic stand in front of a monster with nothing but a cutting tool and her own body. He saw 19 humans hold a corridor against a force 10 times their size and not give a single step. His aide, a young Marathi who had never seen combat, turned to him with wide eyes. "Counselor, what is happening to them? What are these creatures?" Thevin watched the screens for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was very quiet, and there was something in it that had never been there before. Something that sounded almost like fear, but not quite, closer to awe. "I think," he said slowly, "we have made a terrible miscalculation about these people." The battle had been raging for 47 minutes, and the Baekho was dying. Captain Yoon Nari knew it. She could feel it in the way the ship moved, sluggish and heavy, like a wounded animal dragging itself forward. Half the decks had lost power. The port weapons array was gone. The forward shields were holding at 11%, which meant they were barely holding at all. 3 sections of the ship had been sealed because they were open to space. The engine was running hot, too hot, and the chief engineer had told her 10 minutes ago that they had maybe 30 minutes before the reactor started to fail. Nari had thanked him and told him to get her 35. Around the station, the Vreth fleet was regrouping. The Baiko had hurt them. Nari had destroyed or crippled 9 of their ships, an impossible number for a single frigate, and the Vreth commanders were treating the small human vessel with a new and grudging respect. They had pulled back to reform their lines, but they were not retreating. They were preparing for a final push. On the bridge, Lieutenant Park Jinu wiped blood from his forehead. A piece of ceiling panel had hit him during the last impact, opening a cut above his left eye. He had pressed a bandage against it with one hand and kept working with the other. His console was cracked and flickering, but it still worked. He was still tracking every enemy ship, still calculating, still thinking. Beside him, Communications Officer Choi Eun-ji sat at her station with her headset on. She had been broadcasting a distress signal to human colonial space since the first minute of the battle. A tight beam encrypted burst aimed at the nearest human fleet base. Her voice on the recording was calm and professional, the way they trained you to be, but her hands shook slightly each time the ship took a hit. Now she turned to Nari with something in her eyes that was almost hope. I have confirmation. The signal was received. 3rd Expeditionary Fleet is responding. 47 ships. They are coming at maximum speed. Nari closed her eyes. Time. 40 minutes. Nari opened her eyes. 40 minutes. She looked at the tactical display, at the Vreth fleet reforming, at her own ship's damage report, at the numbers that told her, clearly and without emotion, that the Baiko could not survive another full engagement. She had a choice. She could retreat, pull the Baiko away from the station, run for open space, and wait for the fleet to arrive. The ship might survive. Her crew might live. It was the logical choice, the smart choice. Any tactical manual in the galaxy would have told her to do exactly that. Behind her, Station Orivas floated in the dark, its hull scarred and smoking. Inside it were over 3,000 beings. Diplomats, staff, civilians, medical personnel, Marathi and Pelkin and Tessani, and dozens of other species who had no warships nearby. No way to defend themselves, no way to run. Nari did not retreat. She turned to her helmsman and said, "Put us between the Vreth fleet and the station. All stop. Hold position." The helmsman looked at her. He understood what she was asking. She was asking him to park a crippled ship in the path of an armada and wait. Not to fight, not to run. Just to stand there between the enemy and the people behind them and take whatever came. He executed the order. The Baiko drifted forward and stopped, hanging in space like a shield made of metal and will. Its damaged hull faced the Vreth fleet. Its engines went quiet. It simply sat there, small and broken and absolutely immovable. In the council chamber, every delegate watched the external feeds in complete silence. They saw the Baiko take its position. They saw this tiny, battered ship place itself between them and the enemy, and they understood what it meant. The ship was not fighting anymore. It was standing guard. Ambassador Goluri stared at the screen. The Pelkeen who had called humans pet herbivores, who had laughed at their flinching and their feelings, stood with his mouth slightly open. He turned to Kang Do-hyun, who was standing nearby, his suit torn and dusty from the fighting in the corridors. "Why?" Goluri said, and his deep voice was rough and confused. "Why does your ship not retreat? It is destroyed. It cannot fight. Why does it not save itself?" Do-hyun looked at the Pelkeen ambassador. His face was tired, and there was blood on his lip from where he had been hit by debris. But his eyes were clear and steady. "Because you are behind us," he said. Goluri had no response. He opened his mouth, closed it, and looked back at the screen. His massive hands hung at his sides, and for the first time in his life, the great Pelkine predator felt something he had no word for. Inside the station, something shifted. The alien species who had been paralyzed by fear began to move. Not away from the fighting, but toward it. A Marathi security team that had been scattered and broken reformed under Do-hyun's direction, their silver forms taking positions at the barricades with a new determination in their eyes. A group of Pelkine dock workers, huge and strong but untrained in combat, picked up heavy tools and formed a defensive line alongside the human Marines. A Tasani communications team, too small and fragile to fight, took over the station's internal channels and began coordinating between defense teams, relaying positions and movements with quick, precise chirps. For the first time since the attack began, the station fought as one. The Vreth boarding parties inside the station met this new resistance and slowed. They were used to fear. They were used to enemies who broke and ran. They did not know what to do with enemies who stood together and refused to give ground. Outside, the Vreth fleet launched its second assault. The warships moved forward in a tight formation, concentrating their fire on the Baiko. The first barrage hit the frigate's forward shields, and they collapsed. The second barrage struck the hull directly. Deck 3 decompressed. Deck 5 lost power completely. The medical bay shook so hard that Hansumi was thrown against a wall, and she got up with a bruised shoulder and kept working. The Baiko shuddered and groaned. Metal bent. Systems failed. Lights went dark, replaced by the dim red glow of emergency power. On the bridge, a console exploded and killed the officer sitting at it. Nari did not look away from the tactical display. She could not afford to. Not yet. Park Jinu, bleeding and exhausted, stared at his cracked console and saw something. A possibility. Desperate and dangerous, but possible. He ran the numbers 3 times in 2 seconds, then turned to Nari. "Captain, if we route all remaining reactor power into the electromagnetic pulse array and fire it in a directed burst, we can disable every Vreth ship within 2,000 meters. It will knock out at least 5 or 6 of their forward vessels." Nari looked at him. "And the Baiko?" "Dead. No power, no engines, no weapons. We will be a metal shell floating in space." Nari looked at the screen. The Vreth fleet was closing. Behind her, the station hung in the dark, full of people who were counting on her. "Do it." Jinu fired the EMP. The burst erupted from the Baiko like a wave of invisible light, and everything in its radius went dark. 6 Vreth warships lost all power simultaneously, their systems fried, their weapons dead, their ships drifting lifelessly. The forward assault stopped in an instant, and the Baiko went dark with them. Every light on the ship died. Every system shut down. The engines fell silent. The screens went black. The hum of life support faded to nothing. In the council chamber, the external feeds showed the Baiko as a dark shape against the stars, lifeless and still. No lights, no signals, no movement. Counselor Thevin gripped his console. "Are they dead?" Nobody answered. Nobody knew. Every alien in the council chamber stared at the dark shape of the Baiko and felt something heavy settle in their chests. The ship that had fought for them, bled for them, stood between them and death, was now nothing but a cold, dark shell. Then a light appeared. It was small and weak, a tiny white flicker on the Baiko's outer hull. Not an electronic signal, not a system coming back online. It was a manual signal lamp, a simple device powered by a hand crank, the kind of thing humans had used on ocean ships centuries before they ever went to space. The light blinked in a pattern. Short, long, short. Pause. Long, long, short. A rhythm, a code. Park Jinu, who had studied human history as much as human tactics, recognized it immediately. Morse code, an ancient human communication system, older than electricity, older than radio. He translated it for the chamber, his voice quiet and shaking. Still here, still fighting. Hold on. On the outer hull of the Baiko, Sergeant Bei Tae-sung stood in a vacuum suit, exposed to open space, cranking the signal lamp with his bare hands inside his gloves. Behind him, the dead ship floated in silence. Around him, the stars burned cold and distant. He kept cranking, kept sending the message, over and over, because someone had to tell them that the humans were not done yet. In the council chamber, Councillor Theven closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet. Among the Marathi, tears were rare. They were considered the deepest expression of emotion a Marathi could show, reserved for moments of loss so great that the body could not contain it. But Theven was not crying from grief. He was crying because in all his 90 years on the council, across all the species he had known and all the wars he had witnessed, he had never seen anything as stubborn, as defiant, as purely and impossibly brave as a broken ship in the dark, crewed by bleeding humans, flashing a light that said, "Hold on." The Vreth fleet recovered quickly. Their disabled forward ships drifted uselessly in space, but the rest of the formation was untouched. Over 30 warships began to move again, closing the distance toward the powerless Baiko and the wounded station behind it. Their weapons charged, their formation tightened. There would be no more hesitation, no more caution. The insectoid commanders had learned to respect the small human ship, and they intended to make sure it never moved again. In the council chamber, the delegates watched in helpless silence. The external feeds showed the Vreth fleet advancing like a dark tide, and between them and the station, the Baiko floated dead and dark. Its only sign of life, that tiny blinking lamp on the hull. Councillor Theven stood with his hands at his sides. He had stopped giving orders. He had stopped calling for surrender. There was nothing left to do but watch. Kang Do-yun stood at the front of the chamber, his eyes on the screen, his face unreadable. He had not moved in several minutes. He had not spoken. He was watching the Vreth fleet approach, and he was counting. Not the enemy ships, not the seconds until impact. He was counting something else, something only he could feel. A young Marathi aide, trembling beside Theven, whispered, "It is over, Counselor. They are coming." Do-yun heard him. Without looking away from the screen, he said quietly, "Yes, they are." No one understood what he meant, not yet. At 15:14 hours station time, the space behind the Vreth fleet tore open. There was no other way to describe it. The fabric of normal space split apart in 47 places simultaneously, and from each tear, a warship emerged. They came out of faster-than-light travel in perfect formation, a wall of gray and white steel stretching across the void. Heavy cruisers, destroyers, escort carriers, and at the center the massive shape of the HSS Dangun, a heavy carrier nearly a kilometer long, its hull painted with the same white tiger emblem as the Baiko. The 3rd Expeditionary Fleet, 47 human warships, and they were already in attack position. The Vreth fleet had exactly 4 seconds to react. They did not get to use any of them. The human fleet opened fire with a coordinated precision that made the Baiko's solo fight look like a gentle warning. Every ship fired at the same instant. Every shot was aimed. Every target was chosen not to destroy, but to disable. Weapon systems were hit first, then engines, then communications. The human fleet moved through the Vreth formation like surgeons, cutting away the ability to fight with clean, exact strikes. The Vreth tried to respond. They turned their ships, fired back, attempted to regroup. But the human fleet was already adapting, already shifting formation, already 3 steps ahead. Where the Baiko had fought with desperate creativity, the 3rd fleet, fought with cold, methodical efficiency. Every ship knew its role. Every captain knew the plan. They moved as one, not with the hive mind of insects, but with the coordinated trust of a pack that had hunted together 1,000 times. 11 minutes. That was how long it took. In 11 minutes, the entire Vreth fleet was disabled, not destroyed. Every ship was left intact, its crew alive, its hull whole. But every weapon was silent. Every engine was dead. Every communication system was dark. 34 warships, each one larger and more powerful than the Baco, hung in space like dead fish in still water, helpless and silent. The human fleet did not fire a single unnecessary shot. In the council chamber, no one moved. The screens showed the Vreth fleet, motionless and defeated, and the human fleet holding formation around them in a perfect ring. It was not a battle. It was a demonstration. A quiet, terrifying demonstration of what happened when humanity stopped being polite. A human recovery shuttle launched from the Dangun and flew to the Baco. The shuttle docked with the dead frigate, and a rescue team entered through the emergency airlock. They found the crew alive, battered, bleeding, exhausted, but alive. Han Sumi was in the medical bay, still treating wounded, still working, her hands red and her face gray with fatigue. Bei Taesung was still on the outer hull in his vacuum suit, still cranking the signal lamp. He had not stopped. Even after the fleet arrived, even after the Vreth were disabled, he kept sending the message. Still here, still fighting, hold on. When a rescue team member told him it was over, he nodded, set the lamp down carefully, and walked back inside. He did not say anything about being a hero. He went to his bunk, sat down, and picked up his book of poems. Park Jinu was at his console, unconscious. He had passed out from blood loss sometime in the last 10 minutes, but his hand was still on the tactical display, his fingers resting on the firing controls. Even unconscious, he had not let go. Captain Yoon Nari was in her chair. She had not left it since the battle began. Her hands were locked on the armrests so tightly that the rescue team had to gently pry them free. When she opened her eyes and saw the rescue team leader, she said, "Report. Third Fleet is here, Captain. Vreth Fleet is disabled. Station is secure." Nari looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, "I know. I could feel them coming." In the council chamber, Kang Do-hyun watched the rescue on the feeds. He watched them pull his people out of the broken ship. Watched them carry Jinu on a stretcher. Watched Sumi finally sit down and put her head in her hands. Something moved behind his eyes. Something that was not the cold focus of battle, but something older and warmer. He blinked, and when he opened his eyes again, the soldier was gone. The diplomat was back. He straightened his torn suit. He wiped the blood from his lip with the back of his hand. He walked to the human delegation's podium at the front of the chamber, and he stood there, looking out at the hundreds of alien delegates who stared back at him in total silence. He did not speak immediately. He let the silence hold. He looked at each section of the chamber, at the Marathi, and the Pelkine, and the Tasani, and all the others, and he saw their faces. He saw fear and confusion and shock, but he also saw something else, something new. Then he spoke. 12 years ago, when we joined this council, many of you asked what humanity could offer the galaxy. You looked at us and saw a young species, emotional, fragile. You saw us smile and laugh and cry, and you thought that made us weak. Some of you called us soft. Some of you called us prey. He paused. His voice was steady, not angry, not proud, just honest. You were not entirely wrong. We are all of those things. We are soft. We are emotional. We feel things deeply, and we are not ashamed of it. But we are also the species that hunted animals 10 times our size across open plains, not because we were stronger or faster, but because we simply refused to stop. We crossed oceans in boats made of wood. We flew to our moon in a machine made of metal thinner than the armor on a Pelkine's shoulder. We split the smallest piece of matter in the universe and found enough power inside it to destroy our own world. And then, we chose not to. He looked at Galuri. The Pelkine was standing still, his massive form rigid, his eyes wide. We are kind because we choose to be. We are gentle because we know what we are capable of when we are not. Today, we did not fight because we wanted to. We fought because something threatened the people we have decided to protect. He looked at Theven. The old Marathi diplomat stood with his hands clasped, his silver face still wet with the tears he had not wiped away. You are those people. All of you. Every species in this chamber, every being on this station. You are ours now, and we do not abandon what is ours. That is what humanity offers the galaxy. Not our technology, not our ships. Us. The chamber was silent. The silence lasted for a long time. Then Counselor Theven did something that made every Marathi in the room gasp. He placed his hand over the center of his chest, the place where the Marathi believed the soul lived, and he bowed. It was the deepest gesture of respect his species had, reserved for moments of such significance that the Marathi historical archives contain fewer than 20 recorded instances in their entire civilization's history. No non-Marathi had ever received it. Until now. One by one the delegates stood. The Tesani rose on their thin legs and spread their small wings in a gesture of honor. A delegation of massive stone-skinned beings from the outer sectors pressed their fists to the ground, their species' sign of absolute loyalty. Others stood simply because they did not know what else to do, because something had happened in this chamber that was larger than any of them, and standing felt like the only appropriate response. Ambassador Galuri rose last. The great Pelkine stood slowly, his armor plates shifting, his huge hands hanging at his sides. He looked at Do-Hyun across the chamber, and for a long moment, the two of them simply stared at each other. Then Galuri raised both hands, palms open, and pressed them together in front of his face. It was the Pelkine acknowledgement of a superior predator, a gesture his species made only to the most dangerous hunters they had ever encountered. It was not given out of fear. It was given out of recognition. His hands were shaking. The session did not resume that day. There was nothing else to say. In the medical bay of the Dangun, Captain Yoon Nari lay on a cot, her body finally allowed to feel the exhaustion she had been holding back for hours. An alien commander from the station's Joint Defense Force visited her, a tall Marathi officer who had fought alongside humans in the corridors. He stood at the foot of her cot and asked her the question that every alien on the station wanted answered. Captain, how did you find the courage to stand against an entire fleet alone, with one ship, knowing you could not win? Nari looked at him. Her eyes were tired, but they were the same eyes that had guided the Baiko through an impossible fight, without a single moment of doubt. You do not need courage when you have something to protect, she said. You just need to not stop. The Marathi officer stood there for a long time after she closed her eyes. Then he turned and walked away in silence, carrying those words with him like something precious. In his bunk on the Baiko, which now had emergency power restored and lights flickering back to life, Park Jinu sat with his head bandaged and his journal open on his lap. His hands were stiff and his vision was slightly blurred, but he could still write. He turned to a fresh page and thought for a moment. Then he wrote, in small, neat letters, Day 1 of Year 13 in the Galactic Community. I think they finally see us. He closed the journal and set it on his pillow next to Taesung's book of poems. Somewhere nearby, he could hear Sumi heating water for tea, and Unji, humming a song that her mother used to sing. The ship was broken. The crew was wounded. But they were alive, and they were together. And for now, that was enough. The Galactic Council's official archive, updated decades after the event, would record the Arrivas incident as the single most significant moment in human galactic relations. It would note the reclassification of humanity from Category 6, Endurance Persistence Predator, to a new designation, created for this species alone. A designation that no other species in the history of the galaxy had ever received or would ever receive. Category 0. Apex Guardian Species. And beneath the official classification, in a footnote that was technically against protocol, but that no one ever removed, someone had added 7 words. Do not threaten what they love.